Hello, friends. It is good to be with you again. Here we are at Jesuit Lunch Hour, as always, powered by be@jesuit.org. I am Father Michael Rossman, and today I am joined by Mr. Kyle Baker. Welcome to Jesuit Lunch Hour, Kyle.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Michael. Thanks for the invitation.
And we have a bit of a delay in our conversation. Hopefully, it's not too disruptive. Oh, except he just disappeared. So I might be flying solo briefly and maybe entirely, which is interesting. Kyle, man, it looks like he's back right now. Kyle, why don't you tell us why your internet is perhaps not at a super high speed?
Sure. So I am currently on the Coeur d'Alene Reservation in DeSmet, Idaho, named after DeSmet. And this is just a great practical introduction into some of the challenges that rural America face in regard to internet access.
Absolutely, absolutely. And while you are not from Idaho, you're originally from roughly that part of the country, right? Can you say a little bit about your background?
Yeah, sure. I actually grew up just about an hour north of here in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. And I was born there, grew up there, and then I went to college in Montana at Carroll College, which is a small diocesan liberal arts school. And that's where my journey of Catholicism and things like that began. And then after that, I was a teacher, elementary school teacher. I did the ACE program, Alliance for Catholic Education at Notre Dame, which is a graduate service teaching program. Go Irish! And then moved around. I was a consultant for school systems, and I did a lot of work around the shaping of intentional culture in educational environments. And then to work at Carroll as the chief of staff entering the society. So I just recently was missioned to Boise, Idaho, which is 7 hours south of here, to be a campus minister at Boise State. But I came up here today to visit my spiritual director, who's the pastor at Sacred Heart Mission here.
Great, great. Perhaps we could just take a half step back and maybe you could say a little bit about your experience at Carroll College as an undergraduate student. So I also know
Yeah.
that you worked there later because you did not arrive at Carroll as a Catholic, right? Perhaps you could say a little bit about your journey there and what led you to the church.
Sure. So when I was getting ready to graduate from high school, I had been an athlete my whole childhood, played every sport that they would let me play, and was kind of holding out, hoping that I might get a scholarship to a Division I school. But I was a 5'11" offensive lineman. There's not a big market for that. And so eventually I started to realize that probably wasn't going to happen, and had a high school coach who really encouraged me to take a look at smaller schools
Mhm.
and to keep playing for a little longer. And so I started to do that. And one of the schools I visited was Carroll. And I visited a number of other schools. I was a pretty good student, so I had some options. And honestly, it just came down to a plus or minus list, and Carroll came ahead. So I decided to go there, not knowing that it was a Catholic university. And
Mhm.
looking back on that now, it seems pretty funny that I didn't know that. But at the same time, Catholicism was just something that I had no frame of reference for whatsoever. I think the only memory of a very close friend that I grew up with named Sean, and I knew that one day a year he left for lunch and then came back with something. So that was about all I knew. And I found out it was a Catholic school because uh, before our football game my freshman year, our coach one day after practice issued a reminder that I guess everybody else knew, that we would be going to mass before together as a team. And what he said was, whether you're Catholic or not, religious or not, we get to represent the school on Saturday, so this is part of the way that we're going to prepare. And interestingly, that practice extends for many years at Carroll, that teams go to mass together, which isn't true of every Catholic athletic program. But when the guy I played for interviewed for the job, a player that was on the interview panel asked him, "Are you going to make us go to team mass if you're hired?" And he said, "Well, I don't know. What do you think about that?" And the player, who was not Catholic, said, "I think it's the most important thing that we do as a team." And so the coach said, "Okay, I guess." So the day of the first game when I was a freshman, we all piled into a dorm chapel, about 110 meathead football players. And the priests were always very good, understanding that that was the group that was gathered, some Catholic, some not. And I was very by what was happening at the Mass, because people were standing up and sitting down and knew things to say. And then at one point, someone told me, "You can go through the line, but you can't take the thing that they're line." And but I immediately felt very welcomed, and I really chalk that up to the priests who would celebrate those masses. So even though I didn't know what was going on, and at the time I didn't have much interest in religion, I had a little bit of background in the Friends Church. My father's family were members of the Friends Church, but I hadn't had a great experience, which, of course, like most of us, when our religious experiences are fractured as young people or as adults, there's a lot of human complexity involved in that. It has much less to do with God and religion than it does with our human relationships. So yeah, that was my introduction. And then as college went on, around my junior year, I think I started to have that sense and curiosity about there's something beyond. And as I explored that further and noticed the witness really of people around me, some people whose faith and Catholic faith was really important to them, I just started to feel drawn in to it, to the point where I had to recognize that there was something going on. So I went through RCIA my senior year, in great thanks to a campus minister who was compassionate to this wild football player arriving and say, "I think I want to become Catholic." And she helped shepherd me through that. And we were off to the races, I guess.
Great. What a wonderful story. And then, so you mentioned you did the Alliance for Catholic Education, go Irish, through Notre Dame. And so this experience of community life in the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, would not be your first rodeo, living in community.
Yeah.
Perhaps you could say a little bit about what your experience was like living in community before then joining a religious community.
Yeah, no problem. So, like most people that enter life for their lives getting into, when I went to ACE, is a graduate service teaching program. So you're working on your master's degree in a cohort at Notre Dame, and then during the school years, you're sent out to teach under-resourced school. So I was sent to San Antonio, Texas, and I was sent with 6 other people, and we lived in a community. We were all teaching in what the program calls under-resourced schools in an urban setting. And so we lived together. We had what they call a small living stipend that we pooled together to buy groceries and things like that, and cooked together, ate together, prayed together. And I found the whole experience, I mean, I'd lived in Idaho and Montana my whole life at that point, to all of a sudden be thrust into the inner city in San Antonio was a huge breaking open experience for me, the world, my own self. And I found community life to be extremely rich and extremely challenging at the same time. At the end of the 2 years, I was certainly ready to have a break from that. From the whole experience, I think had been very intense and very positive for me. But in the years after that, so I got done in 2009 with ACE, I just that parts of me that were part of my deeper self were being really challenged to come out in community life. And and it was just challenging me to grow in ways that living on my own didn't.
Mm-hmm.
So, for a few years, or for about a year and a half in Denver, some other ACE graduates and I formed the beginnings of a little intentional community. Um, and then I went back to Montana and lived by myself again. But I think it just became apparent to me that my best self was designed to live in intentional community. And that certainly has been the case in the society. It can be challenging. I think I always say that one thing you learn living in community is sometimes you're the jerk. Sometimes it's not the other people. Like sometimes it's you. And so we have to work on that. And sometimes your community members point that out to you. So I love living in community. Yeah, it's a real positive thing in my life.
Great. It's wonderful to hear. And you've lived in community in some different parts of the country as a Jesuit. So you would have done the mission in Culver City or Los Angeles,
Right.
for studies out in the South Bronx at Fordham University, and now you're in Idaho. Perhaps you could say a little bit about your experience as a Jesuit in such varied places.
Yeah, I've been super fortunate. I think really looked out for me in sending me into a lot of different places. And then even as a novice, you're sent to other places. So I was in four other different communities. I spent some time with JRS in Africa and Ethiopia. So I've gotten a chance for the international community as well. And yes, it is tremendously diverse. I think one of the gifts of Jesuit life is you realize how big and diverse the church is, but there are common things that hold our community life together. So we celebrate Mass together differently in different settings. So in the novitiate and in first studies at Fordham, there was Mass in our house every day. I live in a small apostolic community now with only 3 guys, and the other 2 guys are priests, so they celebrate Mass in their workplace every day. So I join them for that. But we do pray together. We have a community night where we take turns cooking. We pray together. So there are things that really hold us together. And you see those things in, like I said, every place around the world that I've been so far, these are common things. And of course, in Jesuit community, we're also held really together by our experience of the exercises as well. So, yeah.
Great. I can't help but think that your experiences in such different parts of the country would also inform how you see our present moment. So perhaps without, getting partisan or anything like that, what thoughts and reflections do you have for this time as we anticipate the election during a moment when I think everyone sees that our nation is rather divided? How have these different experiences kind of shaped your own reflection on our time today?
Yeah. Well, I feel so fortunate to have the experience of growing up in a rural area, semi-rural at least. And I grew up poor in North Idaho, poor white guy in North Idaho, and then now I've gotten to live in areas of affluence and areas of extreme poverty. And then to live in this COVID era around that, and an era of sort of an awakening to the sins of racism. Our neighborhood in the Bronx is in the poorest congressional district in the United States. And then when COVID began, we had the highest rate of hospitalization, infection, and death in the first of the pandemic. So we had, refrigerated trucks in our neighborhood and all of those different things. While here in Idaho, where my family, a lot of people were still wondering, is this even a real thing? Is it overblown? And same with the sort of awakening to the reality of racism in our country. We could see marches and things happening from our building after the murder, and that's a whole different from so far away from like a rural area where I'm sitting right now, and at the same time I'm on a reservation, so there's a deep connection here as well. I think the thing that has happened for me is, and something I've tried to wrestle with, is just like a kind of intensity of sadness around the division that we have, and trying to figure out what to do with that. There are times, and I would caution anyone thinking about the city as a broad group to attach any kind of liberal or conservative notions to that, because like we have a radical diversity of thought within the church as well. Mm-hmm. But I think just that there's a sadness to how did this happen and where do we go from here? But something that's been very beautiful for me in Boise since I was missioned here was I'm given the opportunity to share a gospel reflection at Mass regularly and be on the altar with our Montron, our priest, and to help him as an altar. There's been something really radical about that, about the way that the Eucharist can serve as a point of alignment and coming together, even amidst a lot of diversity of thought. So inside the church, certainly in the context of Mass, but then taking that outside of the context of Mass too, and figuring out what are the things that can bring us together in this certain time. And I certainly, and all of us, have the temptation to feel ourselves sucked into that division as well. And I think now is a time, like the ultimate form of resistance to that, again, modeled by Jesus and the early followers of the way, that there's something bigger at work here, and we're trying to get in the current of what God's up to and love for us. So that's my prayer during these days, I think.
Amen. Thanks, Cal. As a way of wrapping up our discussion, a question I like to ask people is, what piece of advice or what nugget of wisdom might you offer to someone in discernment, whether that's someone discerning religious life, Jesuit life, or discerning some other path in his or her life?
Yeah. Well, I would say 2 points. One, I'm a pretty active reader and always have been, and so I know that not everyone is, but I think there's some really good resources out there. One that was very helpful to me, and again, I have a bias of Ignatian spirituality, but I think Jim Martin's book, Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything, provides a really accessible framework for what Ignatian spirituality can bring to the context of our lives. I think Mark Thibodeau's book as well. But I think some of those resources, spending a little time with those, can be so good. And then the second point, which I've actually shared with you in the past, is when I first acknowledged out loud to someone that I thought maybe super secret mode, some kind of discernment, maybe towards religious life, was something I was open to. One of the first people I talked to is a close friend of mine who's a diocesan vocation coordinator. And I was nervous about talking to him because I was pretty sure that diocesan life, I wasn't feeling a draw to that. And so I was nervous, but someone encouraged me to go talk to him. We run together and ski together. And I sat down in his office and he listened to what I had to say. I mentioned that I thought discernment with the society was something I wanted to explore. And this is what he said, and I would give this to advice to anyone, is he said, I think this is great. And what I think is true is that something is happening inside of you, and that God is speaking to you in a unique way right now. See that you have a desire to respond to that. So let's just take a minute and just be still and silent and appreciate that that's really good. And that just opens the gateway, this idea of what's good is God's loving me in a particular way, and I want to love in return. Heming says in his interpretation of the exercises, right? God loves us, and we live our lives as a love response. And there was just that moment of stillness and gratitude that something good is happening here. I think is so critical in any form of discernment. And we're so good at being busy and clouding up our time and our minds. And sometimes we just need to be still for a little bit. So when I work with guys who are discerning or people who are discerning about other decisions, I just start with, could you have 5 minutes of stillness? And let's start there, and then we'll talk about what's next after that. 5 minutes of stillness a day. So I think for me, that's really critical.
Great. Cal, thanks so much. I think I have a sense of stillness after listening to you, and I bet some of our viewers do as well. This has been Jesuit Lunch Hour, powered by beajesuit.org. Thanks so much, Kyle Baker, working at Boise State University right now, for joining us, and we'll be back next week with another interesting Jesuit. Thanks so much, everyone, and God bless.